Hey everyone, and welcome back to Fine Print. Today we're going to be covering Period 3 of AP US History. If you haven't checked out Episode 1 and Episode 2, where we covered Period 1 and Period 2 of APUSH, be sure to check those out so you can follow a chronological order with the AP course material. Period 3 covers the period from 1754 to 1800 in the American history. This is the time period when the Americans fought the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, and led to the creation of the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. So without further ado, let's get started with Period 3. Period 3 begins with the French and Indian War, which was fought between the period 1754 to 1763 between France and Britain. The French set up a military camp at a fort in the Americas. This led Britain to develop increased anger towards the French. They sent George Washington, a young commander-in-chief, to fight against the French. However, he lost terribly. This led British officers to come to America and control American militias to train them. There were three main causes of the war between France and Britain. The first cause was when Britain pushed into the Ohio River Valley, which was a formerly French area. This led France to develop increased strained relationships with Britain. The second reason was that Britain saw its colonies as lazy. They believed that they couldn't support them with goods or money. Another cause of the war was the fact that the colonists, or the Americans, wanted to fight the war as a sense of pride. They believed that fighting the war could help them gain some sense of autonomy from the monarchy, as it would show that the colonists had some military power. The two sides during the French and Indian War were France and Britain. French troops were aided by many Native Americans because of their previously discussed cordial relationships with native tribes. Britain, on the other hand, was largely led by British soldiers, some colonists, and a few native tribes. The effects of the war were long-lasting for the colonists, Britain, and the Native Americans. Firstly, the war was very expensive. Britain lost wealth to defending these colonies and thus increased colonial taxes, which is a major reason of the American Revolution. Britain also gained control of the previously disputed Ohio River Valley. This led to native resentment. Britain, in response, gave the natives blankets for the winter, but those blankets had smallpox, which led to increased native deaths. The natives who were unhappy with the British pushing into their land led to Pontiac's War. This war led to Britain issuing the Proclamation of 1763. It was sympathetic to natives because the natives were the British's allies during the French and Indian War. Britain stated during this proclamation that the colonists in America couldn't settle west of the Appalachian Mountains to prevent further disputes between American colonists and the Native Americans. However, the Americans largely ignored this and settled across the Appalachian Mountains. The concept of taxation without representation largely rose during this time period after the French and Indian War. Because Britain had lost a large portion of its wealth during the war, King George began to tax the American colonies with increased taxes on colonial goods. They justified this response by saying that the Parliament in England virtually represented the colonies, although there was not a single colonial representative that was present. Parliament passed a few acts during this time period, when the colonists were still loyal to Britain. However, they just wanted fair representation. There were no talks of independence at the time. The first one was the Sugar Act. This was a tax on sugar and was a stricter enforcement of the previously enforced Navigation Acts. Next came the Quartering Act, which forced colonists to provide housing and food to British soldiers. The Stamp Act was a tax on printed paper and was the first direct tax enforced in the colonies. The Stamp Act led to many rebel movements in the Americas. Namely, Patrick Henry called on the colonists to force Parliament to recognize the rights of the colonists. The Stamp Act Congress was a meeting where 9 colonies' delegates met to discuss the Stamp Act and its effects. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty was a foundation that used violence to get what they wanted in terms of representation in Parliament. Many people during this time period also began to boycott British goods, and women homespun many of their cloths. Parliament, in response to all these rebellious movements in the Americas, enacted a measure that asserted that the Parliament had the right to tax and make laws for the colonies in every case. Although this act timely eased tensions in the Americas, there was a second phase of crisis that followed. This began with the Townshend Acts. They were taxes on tea, glass, and paper, and also allowed for the search of private homes for smuggled goods. The writ of assistance gave soldiers the right to search American property. Leaders protested taxation without representation. James Otis and John Adams wrote a letter to urge colonists to petition Parliament to repeal the Townshend Acts. The colonists also boycotted and smuggled goods. The new British Prime Minister, Lord Frederick North, urged Parliament to repeal these acts. They were repealed in 1770 and ended colonial boycott. The Americans were mostly calmed down after this. However, Boston remained a colonial hotspot where the American Revolution ideals were largely spurring. The third phase of crisis, also known as the renewal of conflict, began with the Boston Massacre. 5 colonists were harassing British guards. The guards then opened fire, which led to the killing of 5 colonists, including one with mixed African and Native heritage, who would later become a symbol of the anti-slavery movement. Samuel Adams denounces the incident as a massacre, which leads to increased American revolutionary sentiment in the Americas. Samuel Adams further forms the Committees of Correspondence, where Adams and other Americans attempt to continue to raise awareness about Britain's injustices to the colonies. They also exchanged letters about suspicious British activities, which led to increased rebellious ideologies. Britain then issued the Tea Act. This significantly lowered tea prices to attempt to refuel the demand of tea in the colonies. However, the colonists were adamant on boycotting these goods. The most notable instance that happened before the American Revolution was the Boston Tea Party. A shipment of tea arrived to the Boston harbor from England, where a group of colonists disguised as natives dumped chests of tea into the harbor. Some Americans thought it was a good move, mostly the radicals. However, others believed that this was too radical and made Britain more against them. The Boston Tea Party and the intense radicalism that followed led to Britain passing the Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts by the colonists. This closed the port of Boston until the tea was fully paid for, reduced the power of the Massachusetts legislature, and allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in Great Britain. The Quartering Act also became more severe. They also passed the Quebec Act, which established Roman Catholicism as Quebec's official religion, extended Quebec's boundary to the Ohio River, and led to increased resentment towards Britain in the colonies. As demands for independence began to rise during this time period, there were 2 opposing sides whether on to support Britain or to not. Supporters of Britain were mostly wealthy merchants and planters who were benefiting from increased taxes. Negators of Britain who wanted independence spanned from Virginia to Massachusetts, notably in hotspots like Boston and the New England colonies. 3.4 covers the philosophical foundations of the American Revolution. During this time period, there were many Enlightenment ideals that were spreading across America. Deism was a belief in God, but a belief that he didn't intervene in human affairs. Rationalism was a belief that trusted human reason and emphasized science and human behavior over blindly following Christianity. The social contract was a concept of an agreement amongst people to form a government to promote liberty and equality. They believed that power came from below and not above as previously thought, meaning the people would have the power to overthrow an unjust government if the time arose. Common Sense was a pamphlet written by Thomas Paine and argued for colonial independence and the breaking of ties with the British monarchy. It directly attacked King George III and spread rapidly in the colonies and spurred demands for independence. 3.5 of APUS History in Period 3 covers the American Revolution, perhaps one of the most important wars American individuals have fought. The American Revolution sprouted with the First Continental Congress. Delegates met at Philadelphia to respond to Britain's threats to their liberties. They wanted to restore their relationship with the British Crown and not demanding independence. This is a key difference between the First and the Second Continental Congress. While the first one wanted to maintain a good relationship with Britain, the second one was largely radical and was outwardly demanding independence through events such as the Olive Branch Petition. There were three groups of individuals that were present at the First Continental Congress. First were the Radicals, namely Patrick Henry and Samuel and John Adams from Massachusetts. These radicals were the ones who demanded the most from Britain. Second were the Moderates, namely George Washington from Virginia and John Dickinson from Pennsylvania. The Moderates took a moderate stance on the American Revolution. They didn't believe that Britain was entirely right, but also felt that the Radicals were overly radical. The next group that was present at the First Continental Congress were the Conservatives, notably John Jay and Joseph Galloway. These conservatives were completely opposite to the radicals. They demanded very mild protest, and many often wanted to restore the relationship with the crown. There was another group of individuals that were not present at the convention, namely the Loyalists, who were loyal to Great Britain. These loyalists believed that it was entirely wrong to fight against Britain and completely respected the monarchy and parliament. The First Continental Congress Convention adopted 4 measures. The Suffolk Resolves called for immediate repeal of the Intolerable Acts and military preparations of the colonies. They urged the king to address grievances and colonial rights. The Continental Association enforced economic sanctions of the Suffolk Resolves, and that delegates would meet again if colonial rights were ignored. Hearing this, King George III is obviously angered and sends troops to Massachusetts to counter whatever rebellious nature was spurring after the First Continental Congress. Fighting officially began at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. General Thomas Gage sent a large force to seize colonial military supplies in Concord. Colonial militmen, alerted by Paul Revere and Charles Dawes, assembled to face the British, but had to retreat. As the British marched back to Boston, these Minutemen fired at British soldiers, resulting in many British casualties. The Battle of Bunker Hill was where the colonial militia of Massachusetts farmers fortified Bunker Hill. The British force attacked the position and took the hill, but suffered many losses. Although the Americans didn't obviously win the Battle of Bunker Hill, they viewed this as a slight American victory due to the immense number of British casualties. We now come to the Second Continental Congress, a convention starkly different from its predecessor. The New England colonies thought that the colonies should now declare open independence. However, the Middle colonies were adamant on negotiation and diplomatic measures to ensure that they didn't strain their relations with the crown. The Declaration of the Causes and Necessities for Taking Up Arms called on the colonies to provide troops. Washington was named Commander-in-Chief for a new American colonial army and authorized a force under Arnold to raid Quebec to draw Canada away from the British. The American Navy also organized to attack these British ships. The Olive Branch Petition was where the colonies pledged their loyalty to Britain, but asked the king to intercede with Parliament to secure protection of colonial rights. Although they were still not demanding complete independence, the king completely ignored this petition and issued a prohibitory act. This declared all the colonies in a state of rebellion. The Declaration of Independence was soon drafted by Thomas Jefferson. He listed grievances against King George III's government and spoke about Enlightenment ideals such as unalienable rights, the consent of the governed, and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There were many groups of individuals that were involved in the American Revolution, and each had their own strengths and weaknesses. For the British, they had abundant natural resources, a large population, a wealthy economy, a trained army, and the most powerful navy in the world. However, they fell short when it came to fighting overseas, as it wasn't efficient and required them to cross a huge ocean in the middle. The next were a group of colonists known as the Patriots. Their strength lied in their strong commitment and unity to the independence cause. They also had African American support, as opposed to the British. The Patriots, however, had many weaknesses in their fighting. They were short of supplies, were poorly equipped, rarely paid, and there were many people not wanting to travel outside of their own cities. African Americans also fought in this war cause. They believed that freedom was at the line. Britain and the colonies both offered freedom to slaves who joined their respective side. However, most African Americans joined the Patriots. Next were a group of loyalists, also known as Tories. Their strengths lied in the fact that they supplied the British with food and arms. They joined in raids and were mostly wealthy and conservative Americans. Native Americans were also initially reluctant to join the war, however, soon sided with Britain in the guarantee for limited colonial settling. The first 3 years of the American Revolution were tough on the American army. Washington's forces were nearly crushed by the British after the takeover of New York and Philadelphia. Valley Forge was a name given to Washington's demoralized troops who spent the harsh winter of 1777 and 1778 camping at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. Inflation increased, demand decreased, goods were scarce, and the currency in America became almost worthless. The turning point for the colonies, however, came in the Battle of Saratoga. British forces under General Burgoyne marched from Canada to cut off New England from the colonies. However, they were attacked at Saratoga by American generals, and the British were forced to surrender. France during this time period gets openly interested in allying with the colonies to weaken their enemy, Britain. Soon, Spain and Holland also joined the Patriots in fighting against Britain, forcing Britain to divert their resources and attention from the colonies. Britain soon decided to pull out troops from Philadelphia, and New York became the base of British operations. The Patriots captured British forts in the Illinois County to gain parts of the Ohio Territory. Britain mainly concentrated its campaigns in the South, where there were many loyalists present. At the Battle of Yorktown, George Washington's army, backed by French forces, forced the surrender of a large British army under General Cornwallis. This led to the Treaty of Paris. The treaty said that Britain would recognize the United States as a nation. The Mississippi River would be its eastern boundary, and Americans would have fishing rights on the Canadian coasts. Americans would also pay debts to British merchants and loyalists for property, although these debts were never fully repaid, and in many instances were not paid at all. 3.6 discusses the influence of revolutionary ideals for women, African Americans, Native Americans, and the general American population. First were women in the Revolution. The Daughters of Liberty organized groups against British actions, provided supplies, and worked as cooks and nurses. Many also secretly fought in the battle, such as Molly Pitcher. Female loyalists helped the British as well as the revolutionaries helping the colonists. When it comes to economic help, women ran family farms and businesses and provided food and clothing to soldiers. The concept of Republican motherhood called for educating women so that they could teach their children values of the new republic and their roles as citizens. It gave women a more active role in shaping the new nation, but didn't imply equality. The Continental Congress abolished the importation of enslaved people, and many colonies followed. Slavery was in decline until the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, which developed a rationale to justify slavery by previous slave owners who saw slavery as the only way to gain economic prosperity. Many leaders wanted slaves to be free. However, they didn't envision a society where whites and free blacks could live together, and many wanted them to return to Africa after freedom. Since the natives supported the British, they didn't benefit from colonial independence. The colonists' racism forced many native tribes to get pushed out of their own land further westward. The Enlightenment ideals, as well as the success of the American Revolution, spread to France in the French Revolution and Haiti in the Haitian Revolution. They all cited the Declaration of Independence in their own independence movements. 3.7 discusses the Articles of Confederation. The 13 colonies wanted to make a government, but they always disagreed on political standpoints. Thus, they established the Articles of Confederation, which were written by the Second Continental Congress. Conservatives stressed law and order, but liberals were concerned about protecting individual rights and preventing tyrannical takeovers. Each state constitution had a bill listing basic rights and freedoms. The concept of separation of powers prevented one branch from taking over the other. For example, the legislative powers were given to the legislature, the executive powers to the elected governor, and judicial powers to the court systems. The right to vote was extended to all white males with some property. However, to run for office, you needed more property than regular voters. In 1776, John Dickinson drafted the first Constitution as Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. In 1777, Congress edits Dickinson's draft to include states' rights and creates the Articles of Confederation. Internal disputes over state claims over Western lands led to a delay in the ratification of the Articles of Confederation. However, they were finally ratified in 1781. The Articles of Confederation established a central and unicameral government. Each state was given one vote, and 9 out of 13 votes were needed to pass laws. Congress was given the power to wage war, make treaties, send diplomatic representatives, and borrow money. However, they couldn't collect commerce or taxes. The states knew that the Articles of Confederation was a weak body. The Congress was weak, and the executive and judicial branches had not been yet founded. However, there were some accomplishments of the Articles of Confederation. They represented the first hints of American independence. They contained the Land Ordinance of 1785, which set aside a section of public land for public education, as well as the Northwestern Ordinance of 1787, which granted limited self-government to developing territory between the Great Lakes and the Ohio River, and also prohibited slavery in this territory. These ordinances made the Northwest Territory attractive to white and free black settlers. The weaknesses of the Articles, though, outnumbered its positive influences. When it comes to foreign affairs, European nations saw USA as a developing nation who couldn't take responsibility for its debt. They thought it was too weak to stop Britain from controlling ports and to force states to restore property to loyalists and repay debts to foreigners. Congress further had no taxing power, no dependable source of revenue, limited credit, and reduced foreign trade. This led to an immediate economic depression in the years following American independence. Shays' Rebellion also occurs during this time period, as the economic depression only worsens for farmers. Daniel Shays, a farmer and ex-revolutionary, led farmers in an uprising against high state taxes, imprisonment for debt, and lack of paper money. However, the Massachusetts militia broke up the uprising. 3.8 discusses the Constitutional Convention and debates over ratification. First was the Annapolis Convention. This was a convention that had delegates from 5 states. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton persuaded others that another convention should be held in Philadelphia to revise the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. This is where the Constitution was first drafted, in Philadelphia. Of the 55 delegates that were present, all were white, male, and well-educated. Most were young, wealthy, and informed on law and politics. The delegates unanimously elected George Washington as chairperson and voted to keep meetings secret until everything was confirmed, to avoid uprisings within the country. James Madison becomes the father of the Constitution. Hamilton, Morris, and Dickinson shared a common goal of strengthening the young America. John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Thomas Paine were abroad during the Philadelphia Convention. Samuel Adams and John Hancock weren't chosen as delegates because they were seen as too radical and were believed to disrupt the peace of the convention. Patrick Henry opposed the growth of federal power and didn't show up to the convention. At the convention, some delegates wanted to revise the articles, and others wanted to draft a completely new document. The concept of federalism arose at the convention as well. It was a system with strong but limited central government. Most delegates believed in the separation of powers and checks and balances. However, there was a dispute over whether state size should determine the number of representatives. The Virginia plan supported large states, and the New Jersey plan supported the smaller states. The oppositions that these two plans brought about led to the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Plan. This led to the foundations of a bicameral Congress that we know today, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The Senate would give equal representation to each state, meaning each state would only get one vote. However, the House of Representatives would have representation according to state size. For example, Texas would hold more representation as compared to Rhode Island in present day. The 3/5 Compromise was when the states disputed over slaves counting in the population. Thus, the 3/5 Compromise stated that slaves now counted as 3/5 or 60% of a person for taxation purposes. The Commercial Compromise was when the North and the South had an intense debate on whether central governments could regulate interstate and foreign trade. The North believed yes, however the South, supporting states' rights, said no. The compromise allowed Congress to regulate interstate and foreign trade, but couldn't tax exports. There were many presidency debates as well. Some argued that the president should serve for life. However, others limited the presidential term to 4 years, with no limit on the number of terms. Delegates decided to assign each state a number of electors equal to the total of that state's representatives and senators, also known as the Electoral College. There were two opposing sides when it came to America's political views, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists supported the ratification of the new Constitution. They argued that a stronger central government was needed to maintain and preserve America. Some of their strategies were to emphasize the various weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Their advantages were the fact that they had strong leaders, were organized, united, and many people were on their side when it came to the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Their disadvantages, however, were the fact that the Constitution was fairly new, and the Constitution also lacked a Bill of Rights. On the other side were the Anti-Federalists. These people opposed the ratification of the Constitution. They believed that a stronger central government would destroy the democracy that they had established through the American Revolution. They also believed that it would restrict states' rights. They argued that the proposed Constitution contained no Bill of Rights to protect individual rights, and argued that they thought that it gave the central government too much power. Their disadvantages, however, were the fact that these people were disorganized and ununited. The Federalist Papers presented the reasons for believing in the practicality of the Constitution, and were written by John Jay and Alexander Hamilton. The Federalists won early victories, but weren't confident of victory in enough other states for ratification, following the 9 out of 13 vote concept. The Anti-Federalists said that the proposed Constitution lacked a Bill of Rights and didn't want individual rights to get ignored. The Federalists, on the other hand, said that they shouldn't create a limited list of rights. However, they do end up adding the Bill of Rights. The Federalists soon won 9 out of 13 votes to achieve ratification of the Constitution. 3.9 discusses the newly founded Constitution. Federalism was a concept that included shared power between the federal government and the state government, and used checks and balances to maintain this. In 1789, Congress approved 10 amendments or changes to the Constitution known as the Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments were as follows: the freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, the right to bear arms, the prohibition of quartering, no unreasonable search, the inability of the government to arrest someone without a trial by jury, the right to a speedy and public trial, the cost of the jury being $20, with no excessive bail, and the government could not deny anyone of their rights. The power not given to the country was also unanimously considered the power given to the states. 3.10 discusses the shaping of a new republic. George Washington won a unanimous vote in the Electoral College and becomes the first president of the United States of America. He appoints 4 heads of department: Jefferson for State, Hamilton for Treasury, Knox for War, and Rudolph as Attorney General. This forms the cabinet that we know today. The Judiciary Act of 1789 establishes a Supreme Court with 1 Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices. They could rule on the constitutionality of decisions made by state courts, and provided for a system of 13 district courts. To fix America's financial stature, Hamilton proposed a plan that stated that the federal government should assume states' debts, put high tariffs on imported goods to protect American industries, and to create a national bank to centralize a currency system. The Northern merchants were heavily in support of Hamilton's plan. However, anti-federalists viewed this as an attack on democracy and states' rights. Jefferson, a prominent anti-federalist at the time period, led the anti-federalists against Alexander Hamilton. After much debate, Congress adopted Hamilton's plan with compromises. If Jefferson supported federal assumption of debt, the capital would be moved to Washington, D.C. While America was dealing with its own economic problems, a French Revolution had sprouted in Europe. America and France had an alliance. However, the American people supported the revolutionaries, and many urged Washington to join the war. However, Washington pursued neutrality and believed that the young America wasn't quite ready to fight a war. Jefferson, however, desired to help France, and thus resigns from the cabinet. During this time period, John Jay was sent to talk to Britain about 2 things. First, the British occupation of American posts, and then the British searching and seizing of American ships. The British agreed to evacuate the posts, but continued their policy of impressment. The Jay Treaty was an unpopular treaty, but followed neutrality, which is what George Washington was pursuing. Pinckney's Treaty was when Spain decided to consolidate its North American holdings when it heard that the United States was strengthening its bond with Britain once again. They opened the Mississippi River and New Orleans to American trade. The right of deposit is given to America, so they could transfer cargo in New Orleans without paying duties to Spain. They also accepted that Florida's northern boundary was the 31st parallel. There were many disputes with the natives during this time period as well. The Americans moving further westward annoyed the natives. They formed a large tribe and won many battles against settler militias. Britain supplied them with arms and encouraged them to attack these American settlers. The Americans defeated the Confederacy tribes at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which leads to the Treaty of Greenville. Tribes surrendered claims in the Ohio Territory and promised to open it to American settlement. The Whiskey Rebellion sprouted as Hamilton pushed Congress to tax extra on whiskey. Whiskey farmers resented this and attacked revenue collectors. Washington sends Hamilton to command the militia. The show of force suppressed the uprising with no bloodshed. Jefferson, the critic of the government, won support amongst farmers. The Public Land Act established procedures for dividing and selling federal lands at moderate prices and encouraged rapid settlement in newly acquired land. During this time period, we see the split of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, also known as the Democratic Republicans. Two main leaders for the Federalists were John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. They wanted to interpret the Constitution loosely with a strong central government. Their foreign policy was pro-British, and they believed in developing a large army and navy. Their economic policy was pro-business. They wanted to create a national bank and supported high tariffs. Most supporters of the Federalists came from northern business owners and large landowners. Two key leaders for the Democratic Republicans were Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They wanted to interpret the Constitution strictly with a weak central government and a strong states' rights system. Their foreign policy was pro-French and wanted to develop a small army and navy. Their economic policy was in favor of agriculture. They opposed a national bank and high tariffs as well. Their supporters were mostly skilled workers, small farmers, and plantation owners. Most famously, Washington's farewell address was delivered by Washington when he resigned from his presidency. He warned America to avoid European affairs, permanent alliances, and political parties that could give rise to sectionalism in America. The first two were followed strictly. However, the emergence of political parties during this time period preceded Washington's understanding of the United States' political stature. After George Washington, John Adams assumed the presidency of America. Adams was the candidate for the Federalists, and Jefferson was the candidate for the Democratic Republicans. Adams won the presidency, but Jefferson became vice president. During Adams's presidency, the most known event was the XYZ affair. French ministers labeled as X, Y, and Z requested bribes to enter into negotiations. American delegates refused, and many Americans were infuriated at France and wanted to wage war. President Adams, however, avoided war and sent new ministers to Paris. Most immigrants voted Democratic Republican, so Adams, being a Federalist, raised the citizenship age. The Alien and Sedition Acts allowed the president to deport aliens considered dangerous, and made it illegal for newspapers to badmouth the president or the Congress. There were fines and even prison for those who didn't follow the acts. The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions were plans created by Jefferson and Madison that declared that the states had entered into a compact in forming the national government. If a federal act broke the compact, a state could nullify the federal law. This came in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts. 3.11 and the final topic of Unit 3 discusses the development of an American identity. The state constitution and laws abolished aristocratic titles and power in the hands of the wealthy. There was a separation of church, which was religious, and state, which was political, and refused to give financial support to any religious group, which reiterated the concept of religious freedom in America. The northern states had a decline in slavery. However, the southern states grew slavery. Over time, America moved away from British origins and developed a distinctive national identity. Although America had entered a period of relative peace and order, hostile forces remained on American borders, the British to the northwest and the Spanish in the southwest. The Northwest Ordinance provided a mechanism for migration and settlement of immigrants in the United States. The Indian Intercourse Act placed the federal government in control of all legal actions with Native Americans. However, it was largely ignored by settlers moving westward. Despite the show of force and diseases, many migrated westward and south. In the South, the Spanish were concerned with stopping the incursion of U.S. settlers, and thus gave the natives more freedom. The United States population grew primarily because of three reasons: European immigrants as a result of upheavals in Europe, slave immigration to the South, and the increased birth rates due to abundant food and the desire to have children to help on farms. Most people began opposing slavery. mostly devout Christians and Enlightenment supporters, and many believed that increasing immigration would provide low-cost labor to replace slavery. With the contingent, however, slavery exponentially increased in the South as the demand for slaves in farms increased. Southern plantation owners desired to expand slavery, but Northerners starkly opposed it. Some enslaved people were able to escape slavery by traveling up north to Canada or to Spanish-controlled land. Chesapeake planters began interregional slave trades and broke many families in the process.